Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Again, featuring your host, Philip Wells. And THE is an acronym that stands for Therapy Helps Everyone. And on last week, I had the amazing Giancarlo Simpson, who's a good friend of mine, but also a therapist here in South Florida. He came on the show and we talked a little bit about how therapy has affected him or has helped him, and also how it's helped him in his community and also the people that he's worked with. So if you have a moment, it's episode 5. You definitely want to check that out. And in the comment section, you can find all the ways you can reach him, whether it's for therapy or you can check out his amazing events that he throws every week or every month, called the Eclectic Conversations. So definitely want to check that out. Giancarlo Simpson. All right. So on this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about the top 5 things you should ask someone before you decide to go to see them for a therapy session. So in other words, when you're flipping through or you're searching through the therapist that you want to meet, that you want to talk to, whatever it is, what are 5 questions that you should ask them before you decide to go in for your first session? And I think this is a really good and a very important topic to have, because a lot of people are just now getting into the idea of seeing a therapist, but there's a lot of things that goes into actually deciding which therapist to go to. So me as a therapist, I think it's ideal for me to give my input on what are the top 5 things you should want to ask them. Okay. All right. So number 1, the first thing that I think you should definitely want to ask someone before you decide to go see them for a therapy session is to ask them to simply tell them a little bit about themselves. And the reason why I say this is because you want to make sure that they're the perfect fit. And what do I mean by that is I want you to feel comfortable speaking to this therapist that you're going to see, because the more comfortable you are, the more likely you are to divulge and to be more vulnerable with the things that you've gone through. You know, it allows you that space to kind of be more so yourself versus putting on that facade that a lot of people may put on, whether it's on Instagram, Facebook, or when they're just simply out there in the community. So I definitely think that one of the top things you should ask your therapist is for them to simply tell them a little bit about themselves. And ideally, they will ask you the same thing. And who knows, maybe you guys have something in common. Maybe there's something about his past, your past, or something that you guys are, going through right now, whatever it is, that you guys can kind of relate to, that could kind of help with the therapeutic relationship. And the therapeutic relationship is actually one that's very, very important. And I don't think a lot of clients, maybe even therapists, but I'm going to say clients, know the reasons why it's so important. So what I want you guys to do, if you're listening, I want you to type in Google, what works in therapy? And once you get those results, I want you to click on the images button, because what you're going to find is a pie chart. And in the pie chart, you're going to see a breakdown of what works in therapy. And 40% of what dictates whether or not therapy will work is the relationship that you have with your therapist. And that, again, accounts for 40%. So almost half, think about that, almost half of the outcomes for whether or not you're going to accomplish your goals in therapy is the relationship. And this is so important. And in another episode, I'm actually going to talk about why Black men should seek out other Black male therapists. And I think that's going to be a very powerful, very great episode. Who knows, I may even bring on someone to kind of further explain why I think that's so important. All right, so got that out the way. So the next thing, number 2, you want to ask your therapist what is their niche, or if they have experience working with individuals with this presenting problem that you're coming into therapy with. And the reason why that's so important is that all therapists, even though we're all qualified, we all have our niches. We all have things that we're really good at. So for instance, one thing that I'm really good at is working with irrational thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. I'm also really good at boosting self-esteem, confidence, and I want to say dealing with stress, that work-life balance that some people may fall into, or just simply stress as a whole. I think that's something that I'm really good at. If I ever have a client that comes in and say, hey, I need help because I find myself very anxious whenever I go into work. Well, okay, here are a couple things that I do, but also here's a couple, whether it's worksheets or interventions, strategies, tips, whatever it is, that I think will really, really help you out. And those are things that I can roll out at the drop of a hat. Now, if someone were to come in and ask me, hey, like I'm having marital problems, marital issues, I'm having issues with my significant other, I want to know if I could come in for therapy. That actually wouldn't be something I would consider my niche. And I've actually had a few people come and ask me about seeing me and their significant other. And at the time, I really didn't feel comfortable. So what I did was I referred them. And I actually referred them to, again, John Carlos Simpson, who was a guy who, again, was on the previous episode 5. And the reason why that's so important is because you should want to do your due diligence. So to kind of make this more relatable in the medical field, everyone can go and see their primary care physician, right? Everyone should have one. If you don't, you should think about going to get one. So primary care physician, right? But let's say you have a skin disease or like an infection on your skin or something like that. You can definitely go to that primary care physician, and chances are they probably will be able to prescribe you something, or they'll be able to help you out because they're a qualified physician, just like I'm a qualified therapist. However, it makes sense to go and see a dermatologist, someone who specializes in skincare, versus your primary care physician, even though they're qualified. And it's the same thing in therapy. So you have different types of therapists. You have therapists who may specialize in the things that I mentioned earlier, or you may have what you call a LMFT, so a licensed marriage and family therapist. Okay, there's a lot of those type of therapists that are out there, and it makes sense for someone if you're going through something with your family, or you're going through something with your significant other, for you to seek out one of those type of therapists. Even though someone with the LCSW, so a licensed clinical social worker, a LMHC, so a licensed mental health counselor, whatever the case it may be, those would definitely suffice. But I would say, like, if that's what you're needing to go into therapy for, you definitely want to check out an LMFT, okay? And, you have other people that specialize in things like substance abuse, or you have some people that specialize in mental illnesses, so like schizophrenia, bipolar, multiple personalities disorder, a whole bevy of things. Even grief, divorce. I haven't even talked about those. Trauma. So there's one specific trauma technique called EMDR. And if you have some type of trauma, let's say, you've been in a near-death experience like a car crash or something like that, you may want to check out an EMDR therapist, or a therapist that is certified in EMDR. But again, every therapist that you meet, if they're licensed, they are essentially qualified to meet and talk to whoever it is and whatever it is that they're going through. So again, one thing you definitely want to ask is, hey, what is your niche and what is your experience with working with individuals with this particular concern? All right. Next up, we have number 3. You want to ask your therapist or a potential therapist if they offer virtual or in-home therapy. And the reason why I ask that is that, things happen. Unfortunately, things happen to where, you're not able to make it to the appointment, or let's say, your car is not working, whatever it is, you need a way to still see your therapist. And if your therapist offers e-therapy, which is a thing, or, Skype, whatever it is, that may be something that's more convenient for you, especially if there's a therapist that and let's say you're seeing them, and then you get a job offer. And let's say that job offer is 40 miles away, or let's say it's in an entirely different state. Let's say it's in New York and you live in Florida, and you still want to see that therapist. E-therapy, Okay. So through Skype, through Zoom, which is something that's up and coming, those are definitely things that you want to check out, and you want to ask them, hey, do you provide services through the internet, through Skype, through video, whatever it is? Okay. And then with the in-home, the reason why in-home therapy is important to ask is, outside of all those other reasons that I've mentioned before, a lot of people, they may not feel comfortable just yet going out and walking into a therapist's office, and you also have some people who may, depending on the type of, whether it's mental illness or the reason why they're coming to therapy, leaving their house may be actually the thing that's, giving them problems, giving them a tough time, giving them anxiety. That's actually a disease, a mental illness. If that is the case, then you definitely need someone to come into the house. Unfortunately, I actually had a student like that where they couldn't leave the house. The anxiety was getting to the point where they just would not leave the house, no matter how hard you would try. And in situations like that, you definitely want to have a therapist who can not only provide therapy at their office, but in the home, but also through Skype, through Zoom, so on and so forth. All right. So, number 4. This one is a little tricky, okay? This one is a little tricky. But I always encourage potential clients to ask this question, and I love when my clients ask me this, or my potential clients ask me. And the question is, have you been to therapy? Or what do you do for your mental health? And I really like the first one. Have you been to therapy? I'm going to make an example. I'm going to make a metaphor as to why I think that's an important question. If you ever go to, let's say, a dealership, right? Let's say you go to a Mercedes dealership, and you're looking around, and you want to buy a Mercedes C-Class, because it's a little cheaper than, the S-Class and all the other models, but, it's in your budget, and you really want a Mercedes. You want to treat yourself, let's say you just graduated, or you got a new promotion at your job, or let's say it's your birthday, and you feel like, hey, I really want to treat myself. So you walk up to the dealership, and you're looking around at cars, and as you know, 5 minutes into it, a car salesman comes out. You're going to want a car salesman who has experience driving a Mercedes in order to get him to kind of convince you whether or not to buy this Mercedes, that Mercedes, or just a Mercedes in general. Am I right? Think about it. If a Mercedes car salesman comes out to you and you see that he's driving a BMW, or you see that he's driving a Camaro, or you see him driving an Audi, right? And let's say he's never driven a Mercedes car, then it makes it kind of hard, or a little bit more difficult. I wouldn't say hard, but a little bit more difficult to take his word for the reasons why you should buy that Mercedes. And I think it's the same thing in therapy. I really think that in order for me to make that connection with my clients, I have to speak from a place of understanding. I have to be able to speak from what it feels like to be on the other side of the couch or on the other side of the room as a client and not the therapist. And I think that's so important. And, in grad school, they teach us, oh, you don't want to disclose too much, blah, 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 blah. But actually, it's through disclosing. And, as therapists, you're taught, what to disclose and what not to disclose. But it's through that disclosure where you start to build that bond with your therapist or with your client. And I really, really, really stress that, especially in my therapy sessions. So I think it's a very important question to ask your therapist or someone that you're thinking about to see for therapy. Hey, have you seen a therapist? Now, they don't have to tell you why they've gone or anything like that. I think that part, that's okay. And if a therapist doesn't feel okay sharing, I don't think you should make that a make or break thing. If they don't decide to disclose, then that's fine. But I think there's value in asking that question, and there's value in the therapist answering that question. So, again, they don't have to disclose everything, But I think just knowing that your therapist has gone to see a therapist, it lets you know that, hey, they truly believe in the words that they're saying, or they truly can understand where I'm coming from when I'm speaking about, the fears of going to therapy, or the stigma of going to therapy, or the shame that's sometimes associated with going to therapy, which is something that, I'm working very, very hard to demolish, right? Now, the last but not least, one of the most important questions to ask, and I think a lot of people do ask this, and sometimes they ask it within the first 30 seconds of the conversation. And the question is, what are your fees, and do you take insurance? Okay? So, a lot of therapists, they charge per hour, but also a lot of therapists, they may charge more for the first session than they do for the second session, simply because there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of things to go over in the first session. And sometimes that first session does go over that hour that they will be charging you for. So a lot of therapists will say, okay, so for me, for example, at this point in time, my first session is $100. Okay. But every session after that is $75, because it doesn't take that much time into completing that first session. Okay. Now, also, what a lot of people don't know is that you can definitely call and ask for a free consultation. And a lot of times these consultations are for 15 minutes, give or take 15 minutes. And for a lot of people, that's what they do when they call them, when they first call them, they're asking these questions. Essentially, that is the 15-minute consultation. And a lot of people, they do that with me by calling me via Psychology Today. And Psychology Today is a great website to find therapists. In other words, it's kind of like the classified section of therapists. We're required to put in our license number and all this other information. And then Psychology Today, it'll verify it. So everybody on Psychology Today, if they have a profile, they more than likely are a verified therapist. And you could trust that they are in this field, and they, to some degree, know what they're talking about. So that goes with one of my earlier points when I talked about seeing a dermatologist versus seeing your primary care physician, if you know you have some type of skin disease, skin infection, whatever it is. Okay. So those are the hours or that's how much I charge per hour. But I do take insurance. So as a result of that, many of my clients, they're not coming out of the pocket for that $100 or that $75. They're just simply paying their copay. And based on your insurance carrier, you may pay the primary care physician rate, or you may pay your specialist rate. So that's something that you definitely want to call and ask your carrier about. Hey, when I see a therapist, am I being charged the specialist rate or the primary care physician rate? Okay. Now, another point that I want to make about the insurance is that if you're going to see a or if you're going to see a therapist, and let's say they say, hey, I'm cash only, you can definitely ask them, hey, could you provide me a super bill? Okay. And what this super bill is it's essentially a receipt saying that, hey, John Doe on December 7th at 2 p.m., he came in and he received 45 minutes of psychotherapy, and he was charged $100 or $150, whatever the rate is. A therapist can give you that super bill or that receipt, and you can take that, or you can submit it, mail it, whatever it is, to your insurance carrier. And if you have out-of-network benefits, okay, that's very important. If you have out-of-network benefits, your insurance provider will reimburse you. They may not reimburse you the whole fee of that therapy session. They may reimburse you 75%, 50%, whatever it is. But in other words, you will be able to get some of that money back in the form of like a refund or a check, whatever the case may be. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. So if you go to a therapist and he says he doesn't take insurance, you can definitely ask, hey, do you take out of network? And more than likely, they probably will. And you will ask them for a super bill. Okay. So that's one thing about insurance. And then one last thing about the fees. You can ask your therapist or potential therapist, let's say they don't take insurance and they don't offer a super bill or out of network fees or anything like that. You can definitely ask if they have what's called a sliding scale. Okay, I'm gonna say that again, a sliding scale. And what that is, and it, you could probably guess from the verbiage that I use, based on how much you make per year, or based on how much you made in the last 3 months, right? Your therapist may come down on their fees, okay? And, normally you have to submit some type of paperwork, or you may have to submit or show them that, you are taking EBT or that you're using food stamps, something of that nature. It depends on the therapist. But if you can show them that, you're not able to pay that fee comfortably, then they may or may not offer you a sliding scale. And that sliding scale, it may be for a limited amount of sessions, or it may be for all your sessions. But again, that's something that you can definitely ask your therapist. Okay. And also, bonus note, a lot of times therapists will be willing to sell you packages. Okay. So what do I mean by that? If a therapy session costs, if there's a therapist who charges, let's say $100 for each session, no matter it's the follow-up or no matter if it's the first session, let's say they charge $100 for every session, you may approach that therapist and say, hey, is it possible if I pay for 5 sessions all at once and then I pay you $400, right? That may be something that a therapist may be willing to do. They may be willing to sell you a package or a discounted rate if you're willing to purchase or to buy that service up front. But before you do that, I would even say, definitely obviously talk to your therapist or talk to that potential therapist and see if they are a good fit for you. Okay. So I'm going to run over those points one last time just so that you guys can get a firm grasp for it. So the first one was, simply ask your therapist, tell me a little bit about yourself. And the reason why that's so important is because half the battle in therapy sessions is the rapport. Okay, it's the relationship you have with your therapist, which is why it's so important to get representation out there within this field. So more black and brown faces, more men in this field, right? Also, you want to ask if they have a niche or if they have experience with working with individuals with your specific concern. Ask if you offer virtual therapy or in-home therapy. The next one, again, have you been to therapy, is debatable, but I think is, from my perspective, a very important question to ask. Or you can ask them again, what do they do for mental health? And then last, what are their fees? Do they take insurance? Do they have a sliding scale? And then also if they will allow you to buy a package or buy their services at a discounted rate if you pay for multiple services or multiple sessions. Okay. These are my top 5 things that you should definitely ask your therapist. You can definitely reply in the comments, maybe one question that you think would be great, or if you like feedback on whether or not this is an appropriate question, definitely put them in the comments. I'll definitely respond. Also, please do not feel obligated to stick with a therapist. And I say this as a therapist, okay? So if you have to call 10, 20, 30 therapists, right, on Psychology Today before you find the right one, by all means, do that. And when I get on, when I have conversations with potential clients, I tell them the same thing. I say, hey, how about this? Let's talk a little bit. Let's see what you're coming in for, and let's see if you're the perfect fit. Because who knows? I may not be the right therapist for you, but I can guarantee you that I would definitely try to find a therapist that will fit your needs. And every therapist out there, at a drop of a hat, they can probably name 10, 15, or 20 other therapists out there. Okay? So don't be afraid to ask if they have someone that they can recommend me to. Okay? So for instance, again, I had someone reach out about the couples therapy. Couples is something that at this point in time I really don't do, and that's something that I do want to get into. So that will be my goal for 2020, is to do more couples work. But that's something that at this point in time is not really in my toolkit. So as a result, I will refer her out to someone like a Giancarlo Simpson. So don't be afraid, don't feel obligated or anything like that to stick to a therapist. And that's it. Those are my top 5 things you should ask before you go to your first therapy session. So, again, this is the podcast. The is an acronym that stands for Therapy Helps Everyone. Right now, you can find it on Spotify. Pretty soon, it should be on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and many, many more. Also, you can check out my website, theplayerscoach.net. And also, don't forget to check out my Instagram, The Players Coach LLC. All right. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you.